Band 2. Now the discussion of term limits held Wednesday by the Cato Institute. This program runs just under 2 hours and features remarks by political specialists and those who advocate term limits. We'll also hear a speech by columnist and commentator George Will. The event begins with Edward Crane, president of the Cato Institute.
Good morning. My name's Ed Crane. I'm president of the Cato Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to our conference this morning on the politics and law of term limits. It is perhaps appropriate that this conference is being held here in Washington, D.C., for if the term limit movement has been sweeping the nation over the last 3 or 4 years, it's relatively new here in the district, at least to those individuals at whom it is mostly aimed, the U.S. Congress. It was only a couple of weeks ago, in fact, that the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Civil and Constitutional Rights held the very first congressional hearings on term limits, which probably will come as a surprise to those people living outside the Beltway, where support for term limits is on the order of magnitude of 4 to 1. That subcommittee had on it Representative Henry Hyde, who said, speaking presumably on behalf of legislators everywhere, quote, "The new pejorative is careerist, but when my brain is being operated on, I want a careerist," which is an interesting metaphor, although it does raise the question of whether or not the American people are interested in having career politicians operate on the body politic. In any case, the Cato Institute's Center for Constitutional Studies, under the direction of Roger Pilon and Tim Lynch, has put together this program to examine the issue of term limitation, if not that particular metaphor. We'll have one panel on the politics of term limits, followed by a break, and then another panel on the very important issue of the constitutionality of term limits. Roger Pilon, who is a senior fellow at Cato and director of our Center for Constitutional Studies, will moderate the second panel. Each panel will have 2 of the nation's leading opponents and proponents of term limits, so it should be an interesting conference, and as I say, we're delighted that you were able to join us. Before any of that takes place, however, we're very pleased to be able to present a keynote address this morning by the nationally syndicated columnist and television commentator George Will, who, I might add, in keeping with the balanced nature of this program, was himself a strong opponent of term limits prior to becoming a strong proponent more recently. George Will's column has been syndicated for nearly 2 decades by the Washington Post, and it appears in about 500 newspapers in the U.S. and Europe. He's been a regular contributing editor at Newsweek since 1976 and a participant on ABC's This Week with David Brinkley since its inception in 1981. George is also the author of numerous books, the most relevant for our purposes today being Restoration, Congress, Term Limits, and the Recovery of Deliberative Democracy, which will be available in paperback in January. It's a pleasure then to introduce one of the most insightful and influential social commentators of our time, George Will.
Thank you very much. When the Baltimore Orioles a few years ago were managed by a Napoleonic figure named Earl Weaver, who was the scourge of American League umpires, one of his favorite techniques was to run out of the dugout and shove his chin into the chest of a much larger umpire and shout at the top of his lungs, "Are you going to get any better, or is this it?" The American people looking at government in Washington have decided that it's not getting any better, that this is it and that this won't do. They're thinking of Washington and the politics conducted here the way people used to think of the Washington Senators when they were owned by Clark Griffith, who said one day, "The fans like home runs, and we have assembled a pitching staff to please our fans." Term limits has come along as a remedy for this. I'm not going to talk, Mr. Crane, either about the politics or the law of term limits. That will be covered adequately. I think my job should be to embed the issue in some larger and more resonating philosophic arguments that clearly antedate the contemporary argument about term limits. It is, of course, well known that Americans have always been at best ambivalent about government itself, to the extent particularly that their intellectual pedigree goes back to John Locke, who said that government is a nuisance but necessary to cope with inconveniences. Inconveniences being the operative term. He said that man is a mildly individualist, mildly social, mild creature, and that government therefore has mild tasks and is not perhaps as important as other philosophers have said. It is my attempt, and here I depart, I know, from many advocates of term limits, to advocate term limits to restore the good name of government, and particularly to restore the good name and the supremacy of Congress within our constitutional system. I take my text for my little sermon this morning from Alexander Hamilton from Federalist 68, where he said, "The true test of a good government is its aptitude and its tendency." The point of constitutional questions is, in answering them, is to say, how will these affect the tendency of the government? I will not bore you with the epiphany to which he referred, whereby I changed my mind on this subject. It was, if this is not an oxymoron, a slow epiphany. It began, I think, one day when I was in front of an audience and someone said, "What do you think of term limits?" And I said in the usual Washington way that I was opposed because if we did not have seasoned professionals, we would not have the good government we've got. At which point I began to rethink and have come to raise questions about careerism in the context of a government that has shed all the restraints once implicit in the doctrine of enumerated powers. I believe that the Founding Fathers were, of course, cognizant of the idea of term limits. They existed in the Articles of Confederation. The Founding Fathers, to the extent that they even considered the issue, even considered it necessary to consider it, rejected them. And the Founding Fathers were, in my judgment, right so to do, because term limits are, in fact, an excision from freedom of choice, and all such excisions ought to be justified. What justifies them now is the nature of the modern state. It is, again, my purpose in advocating term limits, unlike some others, is not to make Congress more responsive to the people. Congress is painfully, excessively responsive to the people. It is a hair-trigger seismograph, trembling to every organized appetite in the country. My aim with term limits is not to make Congress closer to the people, but to establish a constitutional distance for a more deliberative process, all of which, as I say, would restore Congress to its proper stature, would cut the presidency down to a size from its current swollen nature that is an accident of, I think, the post-war coincidence of arrival at the same time of television and the Cold War. And finally, by making Congress bolder, more independent, less risk-averse, to encourage Congress to take on more of the issues that it has been only too happy to cede to the judicial branch, and therefore one consequence, I think, of term limits would be to push the courts back to the margin of American civic life where they belong. Now, I speak obviously as a conservative, and many conservatives are in favor of term limits, and that is, in a sense, paradoxical, because there are 4 reasons why conservatives should be very skeptical. I hasten to say parenthetically that for a certain kind of conservative, the scorched earth conservative whose aim in life is to discredit government, that conservative should be against term limits, because a government operating without term limits is doing a most expeditious job of discrediting itself as we speak. But the 4 reasons why conservatives might well be suspicious of term limits is, first of all, that all improvements are for the worst. That's why you are conservative, if you understand that. Second is that most reforms, particularly ones reaching regime-level questions as term limits do, most reforms have not only unintended consequences, but unintended consequences larger and more complicated than the intended ones. Third, one obvious Indeed, perhaps the only certain consequence of term limits is to end some great careers. Not all long careers are great, but most great careers are long. And it is one of the clear costs that has to be acknowledged up front, that they would not, that these careers would be a casualty. And finally, there is, for conservatives, the daunting fact to which I've already alluded, which is that the Founding Fathers didn't choose to include this. Now, in the first place, if you'd asked the Founding Fathers if they should be worried about careerism, they would have looked at you with a blank stare. The idea that anyone would want to live in the kind of cities that were going to hold American government, New York or Philadelphia or soon thereafter Washington, would have struck them as bizarre. Washington, as you know, at the time that Lincoln got here, had pigs rooting in Pennsylvania Avenue. It was not a pleasant place. Indeed, it is arguable that as an alternative to term limits, you could just ban air conditioning. That would have much the same effect in Washington, I think, of ending the attractiveness and the allure of a long career in Congress. But in the Jeffersonian era, those who wanted a long life in politics practiced a kind of musical chairs, serving perhaps in Congress and then going back to, say, the governorship or even the state legislature of Virginia, which to Virginians then and I think today now does not seem like a step down. What began to change in America was, of course, the Civil War, which began to produce the interventionist state and all the attributes of a modern, industrial, united, capitalist economy. It was after the Civil War that the tariff became the dominating political issue in the United States, which armed the career politician in Washington in two ways. The imposition of a tariff conferred a favor, which was politically useful as an incumbent protection device, and the tariff raised money which could then be spent on another group. So it was a twofer, serving the interests of constant incumbency. Furthermore, at the turn of the century, as the world became, not just America, but all of the Western world became obsessed with a sort of cult of professionalism, with an idea that careerism suited the mood of modernity and expertise and science and specialty. It was, remember, only 12 years after the turn of the century that the United States elected as president a political scientist. And it was in this atmosphere of heightened respect for professionalism and expertise and a science of everything, including the social sciences, that we began to see the rise of the career political class as the embodiment of a presumably necessary professionalism and expertise. Well, this occurred rather late in the American evolution and tended to overshadow the reality of a divided American tradition in thinking about public service. And this is a divided tradition that has now been revivified by developments in American historiography associated primarily with Bernard Bailyn and Gordon Wood, who have done a great deal of research in enriching our understanding of the sources and the qualities of the American Revolution and the American founding. It turns out, properly understood, these gentlemen argue, that there is not one strain, as we have often been told, but two mingled strains in the American idea of Republican government. The one with which we're all familiar, that Louis Hart said was the, definite article, the only strain that mattered, is the Lockean strain, which I have alluded to earlier. Individualism, natural rights, limited government, a state of nature that's mildly inconvenient, solved by a social contract that was fairly easy to arrive at, erecting a government with a not very complicated mandate. Against this is a strain currently being still unearthed in the pamphlets and the literature and the rhetoric of the colonial and revolutionary period, is a strain of classical republicanism, which argues that man is a social creature, that participation in civic life is essential to his virtue and to his happiness. And this taps into a preoccupation that the founders had. We think of it most particularly with Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson in their rivalry. They were deeply interested in the sociology of virtue. Jefferson, of course, said, keep your cities in Europe, have an agrarian society, have an expansive society. When in doubt, bend the Constitution to make the Louisiana Purchase for that end. because an agrarian society was necessary for the sociology of virtue, as he understood it, that was requisite for a free society. Alexander Hamilton came to opposite conclusions with a similar aim. He said that a moneyed society with a free circulation of capital and labor was necessary to dissolve the stratification of an oligarchic southern slavocracy of the sort that he feared would otherwise dominate America. With these two people, of course, the polarities of American political argument were struck early. Now, what worries us today as we look at the sociology of virtue that is encouraged or discouraged by careerism in the context of the modern state, with its myriad subsidizing, regulating, and organizing activities that permeates American life, is the fact that careerism now exists in a context of what can best be called supply-side politics. That is, we increasingly have government programs, not because groups demanded them, but we have government programs in order to create groups that will demand their continuation and elaboration. The honey subsidy, the wool subsidy, and all the rest are fairly well known. But we have now developed in this context of careerism, in this context of the 20th century celebration of professionalism and social science, we have developed a novel, and I think wrong idea of national social health, and that is social health can be understood by the quantity of government activity. I don't think that's correct. Now, I don't want to argue that term limits should be favored because they will have particular policy outcomes. I don't think the policy outcomes can be known, nor do I think the partisan advantage of one to another can be known. In fact, I think they're negligible. I would not say, for example, that term limits would result in decreased federal spending. Indeed, it is arguable that if term limits has the consequence that I anticipate it would have, which is to rehabilitate the good name of Congress and deepen public trust of our institutions, it would dissolve the distrust that underlies the current only strong passion uniting Americans, which is taxophobia, and therefore might result in a more energetic federal government. I don't know, and frankly, I don't care. What I do know is that no one seriously defends the current pattern of federal activity, indiscriminate in its use of federal power, and responsive only to the basest, narrowest, and most parochial motives. Now, it is very clear that what we have today is a system of running for office among the career political class that is perhaps the most pure form of entrepreneurship in the United States. The political entrepreneur finds a market, a district. He finds a market niche within that district. He attracts venture capitalists called campaign contributors. They help him merchandise himself on the basis of market research, and they hopefully get a return on their investment if he wins. Now, this is not an elegant and happy picture, and some people say that what we need to take care of its defects and its anesthetic attributes is campaign finance reform. I will not go into that as an alternative to term limits other than to say all campaign finance reform turns in the end on limits on spending and giving, which strike me as facially unconstitutional, as acts of government rationing of the permissible amount of political speech. One not policy outcome of term limits, but I think desirable institutional outcome of term limits is, as I intimated earlier, to establish Congress as what the founders intended, which is the first branch of government. It is Article 1 of the Constitution. It sits symbolically on a hill where the four quadrants of the federal city meet. It should be, it seems to me, the dominating branch of government. It has gone into eclipse in the 20th century, and particularly since in the late 40s the Cold War and television arrived to make the presidency prominent and encourage Americans to confuse prominence with power. In fact, the presidency is an inherently weak office. It is, by which I mean constitutionally weak. There's very little the president can do on his own. And indeed, there was very little the presidents tried to do on their own until Teddy Roosevelt. The rhetoric of the presidency, and here I'm deeply indebted to a wonderful book by Jeffrey Tullis of the University of Texas, published by Princeton, called The Rhetorical Presidency. The rhetorical presidency, the president understood as the nation's agenda writer and moral tutor, the presidency as a constant presence in the American mind, a kind of watery Caesarism that we've seen since really Teddy Roosevelt went out campaigning for the Hepburn Act, is a modern invention, and I think a departure from the proper constitutional balance. It's, of course, well known that between Thomas Jefferson and Woodrow Wilson, no president ever even went to the Congress to deliver, rhetorically, a State of the Union address. Throughout the 19th century, the principal presidential communications were in writing and to the legislative branch, not to the people. What has developed since then is, again, this idea of the president as the nation's moral tutor. It's a very fascinating fact about our presidency that that office is a hostage of the attributes of the occupant of it. The office of Prime Minister of Great Britain was essentially the same in its powers under Clement Attlee or Margaret Thatcher. The powers of the presidency, real effective powers of the presidency, vary radically with the attributes of the man who holds it. Think of Jimmy Carter in the summer of 1979 and Ronald Reagan 2 years later in the summer of 1981. A transformed office. But that means the office is a sometime thing, and it is not a reliable anchor for the government of a great nation. When Teddy Roosevelt went out and campaigned for the Hepburn Act, which, by the way, regulated railroads, and he thought was a regime-level question so important to preventing class division in this country that it justified what he understood to be a departure from the constitutional understanding of the role of the president, he set in train something that Woodrow Wilson was to make theoretical, as was his wont. He was the first president, was Wilson, to criticize the Founding Fathers. He really set the agenda for the progressives and the New Dealers who said that the Founding Fathers' intentions were all very well in their day, but were no longer apposite to a country such as ours. Woodrow Wilson said it is the duty of the president to inspirit the people. His job was the interpretation, his word, the interpretation of the inchoate and unexpressed and inarticulate views of the country. Again, this kind of plebiscitary understanding of the presidency was novel and subverted the genius of the Constitution, which is a structure of indirection, which was to produce a deliberative body in the Congress of the United States. Congress, being the locus of popular sovereignty in the United States, is the locus of the modern political problem. The old political problem, debated for literally several millennia, was the problem of the ruler versus the ruled. And it was originally, as the modern age began, thought to have been solved by popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty would just make the ruled the masters of the rulers. Turns out to be not quite that simple, because the sovereign people themselves can be a problem. And it was de Tocqueville, in this country, looking at popular sovereignty, who said that we needed to worry about a government that could degrade people without tormenting them. It could degrade people by courting them. It was de Tocqueville who raised the possibility that a solicitous, kindly government could, by its hyperactivity, inflame appetites and produce a kind of avaricious, grasping factionalism, which, combined with a weakening of restraints on the federal government's sense of its proper sphere, would produce something like what we have today, a maelstrom of interests, hoping against hope, with a kind of Cuisinart theory of the public interest, that whatever results from the churning, whatever puree comes out at the end of the day, shall be called the national interest. Well, it's not adequate. No one, as I say, is happy with what we have today. Since Plato began the Western tradition of political thought, philosophers have worried about the decay of good regimes. Plato said if you didn't take the right math courses, everything went bad. Shakespeare said, untune that string, take but degree away, and hark what discord follows. Gibbon focused attention on the collapse of Rome and made that a permanent theme in American and in Western political thought. So people have been constantly interested in the problem of decay, a problem of particular poignancy in the United States, because we had a founding moment that is viewed not just through the roseate spectacles of national nostalgia, but is viewed realistically as a golden age of statecraft. And it is now, through the issue of term limits that you will be debating here today, that the American people are coming to grips with an old argument, and it is that constitutions encourage certain kinds of behavior, and the behavior they encourage or discourage has a shaping effect on character, individual character, and the character of the polity. I once wrote a book, read by dozens, called Statecraft as Soulcraft. The subtitle is What Government Does, not what it should do, what it does. And my theme was that government cannot help by the way it functions, by its institutions, by the values it encourages and discourages in its routine behavior, cannot help but affect the soul of the citizenry. Those who favor term limits for the reasons I do so because we believe that by changing the sociology of the electorate, by changing the motives people have for coming into government at the times in their lives when they would have for coming into government, we are more apt to produce a calm, reasonable, civil, detached, and less risk-averse Congress. Virtue, we think, who think as I do, is not natural, it is nurtured, it is a product of artifice, and term limits are, we think, an artifice that will produce something like the kind of virtue that Madison talked about in Federalist 10 when he said it is the duty of public institutions to refine and enlarge public opinion, to add reason to willfulness. Term limits, of course, are not a silver bullet. They are not an attempt to make something straight from the crooked timber of humanity. On the contrary, they are a hard-headed Madisonian reform, an attempt to change the structure of government to accommodate the timeless human motives and the changing nature of the modern state. To those who argue that it is anti-democratic, I say the United States has never flirted for a minute with untrammeled majoritarianism. The first Congress, you may recall, passed the First Amendment, which begins, Congress, the popular branch of government, shall make no law regarding this, that, and the other thing. Limits on the willfulness, on the choice, if you will, of the electorate are not new. It does seem to me that the American people, the lesson of American history is, get what they want, if they want it steadily, intensely, and over time. Today, the numbers are encouraging for the advocates of term limits. Because, as it seems clear, as more localities, city councils, states, state legislatures impose term limits, Congress, by refusing to debate this and send it to the states for deliberation, stands forth increasingly as drained of its legitimacy in a nation that clearly prefers some other outcome than the one Congress is willing to permit. It is my belief, as someone who loves Washington and loves politics and loves the federal government in its way, that term limits can restore some of the brio to politics that I think has been lost. When Barry Goldwater, for whom I cast my first presidential vote, went into politics in 1952, he said to a friend, well, it ain't for life and it might be fun. It is that spirit that I would like to see brought back, and I think term limits might. This is obviously an issue, as all issues other than the designated hitter are, about which honorable people of goodwill can and do disagree. I congratulate the Cato Institution for bringing all this talent together to disagree amicably. Thank you very much.
We have time for a couple of questions, if anyone.
The careerism, the loss of the great careers is a matter that people who oppose term limits bring up all the time. What do you think of the idea as a compromise that one would be limited perhaps to 2 Senate terms or 4 or 5 House terms, but then after 8 years one could run again? The idea being that if the person was that great a career person, the memory of the public would be instilled, and he then could recover his seat for another 2 Senate terms or another 4 or 5 House terms.
That's a debatable compromise. All you need to do is stick the word consecutive in. You shall be limited to 6 consecutive terms in the House, 2 consecutive in the Senate. Another way of addressing this, although this strikes me as gimmicky, is to say that you can only appear on the ballot for 6 consecutive elections. Someone could still get elected by a write-in. That strikes me as disingenuous, tricky. That strikes me, that's arguable. I mean, I dedicated my book on term limits to 2 of my very good friends, Jack Danforth and Pat Moynihan, both of which would have been out of here if I had prevailed. And shortly after I did this, Jack Danforth announced he was retiring, and I called him up and said, "I didn't mean you." Even if no compromise of the sort you talked about can be implemented, I still would favor term limits, accepting candidly up front the costs. If you walk into my office in Georgetown, the first thing you see on the wall is a picture of Henry Jackson over a bust of Henry Jackson, the only pin-up I've had in 20 years in Washington. He came to Washington in 1941 and, of course, died in office in the early 80s. So I know the costs of this.
I would hope those people would come back like Daniel Patrick Moynihan.
Roger Pilon, Cato Institute. George, you spoke of the of changing the motives for coming into government, and which would lead you expect to changing the character of Congress and perhaps of the country. Is it not conceivable that part of the motive for coming into government might be the wish to pursue consciously the public good? That is to say, that kind of mindset that dominates the 20th century, to use government to bring about some conscious conception of the public good rather than to have the public good fall out of simply securing of rights, which is more on the order of what the founding generation had in mind?
Well, I think so. Now, this is a question we can't yet answer, the consequences of term limits on the sociology of the legislature. However, the state of California, performing as, in Brandeis's words, a laboratory of liberty, is going to give us an example. One of the reasons I changed my mind on term limits was watching the campaign against Proposition 140 in California. When Californians voted on term limits, the lobbyists, I will say rudely, the parasite class that exists for transfer seeking of the use of public power for private advantage, came out of the woodwork en masse in California to oppose term limits, thereby refuting the contention so often argued by opponents of term limits that the lawyers and the lobbyists in this town, Washington, are secretly lusting for term limits because they believe they will dominate the new class of what they call disdainfully rookies. I believe that the lawyer lobbyist class, well, I know it to be as opposed to term limits as any group in this country, and they are right from their point of view because they have a very happy relationship with their wired, rented legislators. I mean, the stable relationship that exists between the fundraising apparatus and the permanent government bureaucracy and this class in town here. I believe they are rightly afraid of what would happen if people began to come into politics in mid-career or late in their career, who, if you came to them and said, "You vote against this, we won't support you in the next election," and say, "Well, that's all right, I'm not planning to be here forever anyway." I think you would have people, again, less risk-averse because their identity doesn't turn on this. There are people in Capitol Hill. I will be specific. Take the case of I guess he's still the junior senator from Oregon, Bob Packwood. Bob Packwood has no life besides this. For someone like this to lose an election is personal annihilation. It's not losing an election, it's death. And I think that's unhealthy. And I think you will not get that you can't get that kind of person under term limits, whose entire identity is tied up in being in office, and therefore who brings to the preservation of his incumbents' advantages a desperation that is literally a matter of life and death.
My name's Arnold Moore. You said that you were not very concerned with the empirical results of term limits, that you didn't know whether it would raise taxes or lower them and so forth. But many of us, I think, would like to have some idea of what would come out, particularly given your earlier remark about the unintended results. Mm-hmm. Are you aware of any attempts to study what actually does happen in places where they do have term limits?
No.
Do fewer governors go to jail in states where they have it or not? Are tax rates higher in states where they have it or not? Or are they rising faster, et cetera?
I don't
mean,
think we know enough yet. Again, we're going to get the best test of this is going to be California. Where,
legislature, but
That's
there
right.
are other.
well, the governors have been term limited.
That's right.
The president's been term limited for 40 years.
That's right.
and
Has there been any-
it has not had a noticeable effect. Actually, that's not quite right. Presidents were term limited from the time Jefferson petitioned to run for a third term, said no, that we have an unofficial term limit. We had term limits. We've had term limits since Washington, with one Rooseveltian exception. So yeah, there's no way of making that empirical judgment. You know, a lot of the same people interested in term limits are interested in line item veto. They say line item veto will cut spending. I'm convinced the line item veto will increase spending. Because everyone in Congress will say, well, there's no ethical problem now. I'll just throw in all the garbage and he can take it out. And then he'll come to the garbage and say, I'll leave it in if you'll vote with me on F-16s for Saudi Arabia. And so you'd leverage up government. You can't tell. But I really think there's something bothers me ethically about advocating a constitutional change because of anticipated policy outcomes. I don't think that's what a constitution does. It shouldn't predispose us to a certain short-term policy outcome.
My name is Dan Lowenstein. Most people who debate this issue, including yourself, talk almost entirely about the individual member of Congress and not about the leadership. And I wonder whether you've really thought a lot about and are comfortable with the idea that under term limits, the leadership of both parties in both chambers will permanently consist of lame ducks.
I've thought about it, and I think I like it. I believe Henry Clay became Speaker of the House his second day in Washington, something like that. He just got here and they said, we need a speaker. That guy from Kentucky. Now people say, well, can't do that anymore. The modern state's different. I am not arguing, as Lennon or Andrew Jackson or one of those people did, that any cook can run the state. But I am saying that when you have a state that requires someone to be here 30 years to work on it and get to know it in order to run it, that's time to think about the kind of state you want to have.
The question wasn't about experience, it was about being a lame duck.
Oh, no, being a lame duck doesn't bother me. No, I mean, because what's a lame duck mean? It means someone who's not going to stand for election again. That just means he is liberated from a certain kind of calculation. It's and again, if, say, you have someone in the House who's, say, the Speaker of the House is in his 6th and final term, he won't have been, that would mean that for 5/6 of the time he will be as attentive to the eddies and turbulence of popular opinion as anyone is apt to be who is not making a life here. So I think the difference between being a lame duck and not a lame duck changes or becomes much smaller under term limits.
Isn't there even more of a distinction? That is, a lame duck technically is someone who has lost an election and is serving out his term, so has lost the moral authority of his place. I think that is the way it's...
Well, some people do refer to any second-term president as a lame duck, because he's said to be lame not because people have repudiated him, but because he lacks a certain leverage that goes with being a live political commodity. Yeah.
Sheldon Richmond at Cato Institute. What do you say to term limit advocates who think that Congress is out of touch with the public and term limits will restore, well, let's say shrink the distance that you're hoping to increase?
Well, I think they're wrong. I think Congress is brilliantly in touch with the public. I mean, these people are professionals at monitoring the rivers of public appetite and demand, and of brokering the compromises between them. If that's the kind of government you want, then if you want a Congress deeply attentive to the American people, you've got it. You don't need to change that. What I'm trying to do is give, again, the constitutional distance and change the motives so that people will be more ready to say, think as the common axiom is of the next generation, not just the next election. The public, see, the problem with that formulation is the noun the public. The public is a complicated, multi-layered maelstrom of factions. It's not I mean, the definite article "the" next to the noun "public" suggests there's this kind of great, amicable, homogeneous American people out there. They're not. They're very different. And it's a nation of vast complexities of publics, and Congress, as it now exists, cannot be faulted for being unable to read it or being inattentive to its desires.
We've got to wrap it up.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, George Will, very much for your thoughtful comments. I'd like to invite the first panel to come up to the stage, and we'll get going. While the panel is taking their seats, I would point out that George mentioned in his talk that he thought some of the special interest would be opposed to term limits. In fact, there was last year a Gallup poll that polled corporate representatives, mid-level federal bureaucrats, and congressional staff, and that group overwhelmingly did, in the Gallup poll, oppose term limits. Do we have the... Do you want to put the names down first? So they can sit down? See, we've divided the tables between proponents and opponents, but we will speak consecutively from those different perspectives. Our first panel will look at the politics of term limits, and our first two speakers on the panel are leaders of their respective national grassroots organizations. Our first speaker will be Paul Jacob. He is Executive Director of U.S. Term Limits, and you either love him or hate him, if depending on your views of term limits, because his organization has really done more than any other, and I should say by way of disclaimer that I'm on the board of U.S. Term Limits, in promoting the term limit movement. The U.S. Term Limits, headquartered here in Washington, deserves much of the credit for the 14 states that did pass term limit initiatives in 1992. So Paul is well qualified to speak on behalf of the grassroots term limit movement. On the other side, our second speaker will be Becky Kane, who is president of the League of Women Voters of the United States and chair of the League of Women Voters Education Fund. She's been involved with the League of Women Voters since 1975 back in West Virginia, and about a year and a half ago was elected president of this distinguished organization. She also is active in the environmental movement and has received Common Cause's Public Service Award, and she serves on the National Advisory Commission on Election Law to the American Bar Association. So we'll start with Paul Jacob of U.S. Term Limits.
Good morning. I told my wife when I was leaving this morning that this may be my first and last day as an intellectual. This is, I believe, after all, what intellectuals do. In all seriousness, I'm honored to be a part of what I think is a very important conference being held today by the Cato Institute, a conference that will look at both the politics and the law of the term limit movement. One thing I believe is absolutely clear, and I think people both pro and con on the term limit issue will agree, the American people want term limits. for members of Congress, and actually for virtually every person in elected office. This desire is consistent and strong, both in terms of polling data that's been done nationally over and over again, and also by the 17 states that have already passed term limit initiatives, either for state legislative or congressional term limits. The margin of victory in these states has been on average 2-1, with both Florida and Wyoming actually having a victory percentage of 77% of the vote. In just the last year, New York City and Los Angeles have passed local term limits. The polling data shows anywhere from 75 to 85% support for term limits, but the most interesting aspect of the polling data is that virtually every demographic group supports term limits. It's supported by both sexes, by all races, by all ages, by both parties, by every political philosophy. By every way you can break up the American people, they still support term limitation. Congressional term limits, however, are usually portrayed by opponents of term limits as fueled by blind citizen anger. The people are mad and therefore they want term limits. Debbie Dingell, the wife of Congressman John Dingell, who headed the anti-term limit effort in Michigan last year, called term limit supporters, quote, frustrated children. Beyond the obvious negative connotation of that comes the idea that this issue is simply fueled by anger. But if you look closer, you realize that it's not just the House bank fiasco or other scandals that's fueling term limits. Because if that were the case, then why are term limits passing in hundreds of cities and counties all over the country where there is absolutely no scandal brewing? Why is the support for presidential term limits and the term limits that we now have on 37 state governors very much supported poll after poll after poll? It's because the idea of term limits is supported by the American people not because they're angry at people in government, but because they realize that term limits or rotation in office is sound public policy. Opponents do concede that term limits is supported by the people, but they very quickly add that just because the people like an idea doesn't make it a good idea. Well, this is true in a subjective way, but if you look at a producer of a product, if he were to say, my product is good even though nobody likes it, he might be correct in his own way of thinking. But if he doesn't change his product to make it popular, he's going to go out of business. And in the very same way, government loses its legitimacy if it doesn't listen and abide by the will of the American people. I think that's what we've seen when we look at Congress. I think it's what Mr. Will spoke about. The fact that if we don't change, if Congress doesn't change, they risk losing any legitimacy before the American people. And that, as I'm sure the opponents of term limits will argue, that we risk the presidency becoming too important and other branches of government becoming too important. That risk will become reality if we don't restore the sense of trust and confidence in Congress among the American people. People support term limits to accomplish two basic goals. One, they want to rejuvenate the election process. And two, we want to restore a citizen legislature in Congress and at every level of government. First of all, the election process, I believe, is marked by a clear re-election advantage for incumbents. If you look at 1988, 96% of incumbents who sought re-election were re-elected. In 1990, 98% of incumbents who sought re-election were elected, and 74 congressmen ran without any major party opponent. That doesn't mean choices for the people. It means no choice. In 1992, even with the House bank scandal and with other scandals, and with gridlock that basically forced good members out with the bad, we still had a re-election rate come November of 93%. Why do congressmen win re-election in such high percentages? The answer is very simple. They have every advantage. Let's just briefly look at some of the advantages they enjoy. There's a lot of them, and I won't get into all of them. But the first advantage is the franking privilege. Congress has the ability to send free mail to their constituents. In fact, they had the ability last year to send free mail to people who weren't their constituents. It wasn't an educational process. It was a re-election process because they were able to send mail to people who didn't live in their district but who might live in their district after redistricting, blatantly showing that the goal was to propagandize for re-election. If you think that that's a small advantage, you should remember that the average incumbent spends more in taxpayer-financed direct mail than the average challenger spends in his entire campaign. So this is a very real advantage. Now, it can be changed without term limits if Congress will act. But we all know Congress has steadfastly refused to act on franking privilege, and we'll see what other things they've refused to act on. The second key advantage is the use of staff. A congressman, the average congressman, has 22 staff members and a number of congressional district offices. These staff members do legislative business, but they also do what we call constituent service, and they also work for what we call public relations. Well, what is constituent service? It's basically helping people cut through red tape. Red tape that members of Congress have either voted into existence or allowed to exist because it is the Congress's responsibility to be the watchdog on the executive branch and on the agencies. Public relations, that means getting Mr. Congressman's name in the paper and face on television in a positive light. What do public relations and constituent services have in common? They both help a congressman win friends, influence people, and win votes to get reelected. Who pays the bills? The taxpayer pays the bills, including the taxpayer who may be the candidate who challenges the congressman at the next election. Congress, again, can unilaterally reduce the number of staff or change the functions with which staff members do their jobs. But they have refused, again, to do so. What about media advantages? Well, beyond the fact that Congress has, at taxpayer expense, built a TV and radio studio, the real media advantage that members of Congress enjoy accrues naturally. It accrues because they are the representative for somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 people, and what they say and what they do is news, and well, it should be. But this advantage means that people hear about them every day, day after day, from the very day they're elected to the day that they run for re-election. This advantage is tremendous and can't be changed easily. Campaign finance rules. I'm running short of time, so I just want to very quickly say that Congress has passed the campaign finance system that is presently in place. We all know that it advantages them, it disadvantages challengers, and the new campaign finance bill that they've passed makes it even worse. It locks in PACs with a 3-2 advantage. PACs are 1/3 of the funding process. Another third is the taxpayer, even though they know every survey shows the American people don't support taxpayer-financed campaigns. The other thing that this new campaign finance bill does is to say that if citizens organize in a district and spend money against an incumbent, that the taxpayer, the federal government, will increase the amount they give that candidate to compensate for what organized voters do in that district. It's outrageous. These advantages, campaign finance, franking privilege, and a host of other advantages mean that we don't have competitive elections. How do you solve the problem? By limiting terms and giving us open seats where clearly the financial advantages are not there and where more people can run for office. We need a citizen legislature. What does that mean? It means, as Thomas Jefferson and George Washington showed, that you serve a short period of time and then leave to live under the laws that you have made. The danger of people staying in public office for too long are very clear. Washington knew them. Jefferson knew them. Abraham Lincoln had this to say about them, quote, "If our American society and United States government are overthrown, it will come from the voracious desire for office, this wriggle to live without toil, work, or labor, which I am not free myself." Lincoln realized that the longer someone serves in public office, the more removed they are from the way the people they're supposed to represent live, how they raise their families, how they earn a living. That is the crux of the problem. Beyond the fact that it's dangerous to allow this accumulation of power, it also is important to let new people into the system. And when people monopolize congressional seats or any other seat, new people, new ideas aren't able to come into the system. Madeleine Kunin, the former Democratic governor of Vermont, said, breaking the gridlock of incumbency could throw the doors wide open to new people and new ideas that would make politics rewarding, meaningful, even fun. Term limits will rejuvenate elections and give us a citizen legislature. So why do some people oppose it? Well, first of all, who does oppose term limits? Politicians, labor unions, big corporations who are connected to government, Common Cause, the League of Women Voters, political insiders. They are against 80% of the American people who favor term limits. My time's up, so I can't go into all the reasons that they oppose it, but I think they'll have an opportunity to do that and will rejoin. I'll just leave by saying that recently Thomas Mann, who will speak here today, was quoted as saying that Congress as we know it is not, well, let me get the exact quote, Congress as we know it is incompatible with a term-limited membership. I agree. And that's why I join 80% of the American people in supporting term limits for members of Congress and for every elected office.
Good morning. I'm Becky Kane. I'm president of the League of Women Voters of the United States. I'd like to thank the Cato Institute for the opportunity to be here today to talk about such an important public policy issue and for putting on a forum that allows for the give and take of a discussion on such an issue. Thank you. Our political system is failing the American people. Citizens are disgusted, and they have every reason to be. With the role of special interest and big money in the political process, with the emptiness of modern political campaigns, and with our government's seemingly inability to deal in a meaningful way with national problems such as health care, crime, and the lackluster economy. And just as the American people have a number of very specific complaints about the ways in which government responds or fails to respond to their needs and their concerns, so too are there a very many specific ways that we can fix the American political system. But alas, term limits for members of Congress are not among them. Rather, term limits are a smokescreen, a simplistic answer to hard questions about our government, questions that demand equally hard choices. It's easy, as it always has been, to holler, throw the bums out. It's a more thoughtful, complicated process, however, to throw out the pieces of the system that are corrupting or that don't work, and to keep and strengthen what's good and productive about our government. The truth is that we really already have term limits in this country, and they're called elections. If we don't like the job that our elected representatives in Washington are doing, we can support another candidate and vote them out. While there is plenty that we can and must do to even the playing field between challengers and incumbents, we cannot ignore the fact that incumbents are regularly sent packing from Washington if they are perceived to have lost touch with the folks back home. In fact, many choose to retire because of the type of information and polling and so forth that we do before a campaign. Many of the people choose to retire because they have lost, and they know they have lost, the support of the people at home, so they choose even not to run. What's wrong with term limits? The term limits movement, the Meat Axe approach, does not distinguish between legislators whose careers deserve to be cut short and those who deserve re-election. As a result, term limits deny us the right to choose those whom we think best represent us and our interests. The decisions about how long in office is long enough should be up to the voters, who are the best judges of whether their interests are being served by the women and men whom we send to Washington. Here's what else is wrong with term limits. First, term limits would weaken the legislative branch of government and strengthen an already powerful presidency. Congress must be able to form its own judgments on national issues, to come to consensus independently of the executive branch's policies if necessary. A Congress of amateurs, however, would by its very nature be more pliable and deferential, and the institution would thus be robbed of its historic role of restraining the power of the executive, who controls the entire federal bureaucracy. As a result, the branch of government closest to the people, designed to be closest to the people, would become a less effective advocate for its constituents. Second, term limits would result in increased reliance on congressional staff and unelected insiders. Novice legislators would depend much more on staff to sort out complicated issues and to keep things running. This at a time when many argue that congressional staff is already too influential. Inexperienced representatives would also be forced to turn to Washington political insiders for advice on issues, meaning policy decisions and the oversight of complex financial markets and international affairs would in all probability end up largely in the hands of seasoned bureaucrats, presidential appointees, and judges. Also gaining an influence under term limits would be lobbyists and special interests. Third, term limits ignore the need for enlightened and experienced management of public policy. There's nothing wrong with entrusting complex and critical issues, decisions on these issues that can affect our lives in the world we live in, to people with professional experience. We recognize the importance of experience in all walks of life. Teachers are required to do student teaching. Doctors have to complete residencies. And laborers have worked in apprenticeship for centuries. Why can't we expect the nation's lawmakers to benefit from experience when dealing with such complex matters as the world economy and meeting the needs of a modern society of 250 million diverse individuals? Fourth, term limits would put our elected officials in a position of always thinking about that next job, giving them an excuse not to be responsive to the people who elect them. Elected representatives have a built-in cutoff date. Those election officials who have a built-in cutoff date are less likely to be swayed by their constituents' interest and more likely to respond to the special interest who might provide them with a job, or at least a hand in finding one, after their term is over. And for many, congressional service will become merely a stepping stone to higher office. From day one, term-limited legislators would make decisions and be forced to make decisions, not necessarily with their constituents' interest in mind, but with an eye to their own interest for the future. Instead of having career politicians who are committed to the institutions in which they serve, we will have career politicians with an overriding commitment to, you guessed it, their careers. Fifth, term limits would limit the field of potential candidates for public office. Running for and holding public office is too expensive, too life-disrupting, too privacy-invading, and too time-consuming to become a popular sabbatical of choice for dedicated and serious professionals in other fields. Therefore, the only candidates attracted to run for term-limited offices would be the rich or the retired. And finally, term limits would encourage legislators to consider the short term over the long term. Term-limited legislators would know for certain that they wouldn't be around to deal with the long-term consequences of many of their decisions. Their limited time in office would encourage them to focus on quick fixes and programs that might be wildly popular at the moment, but that might result in severe repercussions down the road. By placing the burden of sainthood and for the good of the country thinking on amateur legislators, term limits fly in the face of political reality. If not term limits, what then? Now, don't get me wrong. political reality, or at least many of the grim realities that have affected our political system in recent years, is certainly worth questioning and challenging and working to change. It's just that term limits are not what we need. They might, in fact, add to what's wrong with the way things now stand. Rather, comprehensive campaign finance reform is a real solution to many of the problems that the backers of term limits are seeking to address. Unlike term limits, campaign finance is a solution that will yield important and immediate improvements in how politics is conducted in this country. The closer you look at many of the problems people point to when arguing for term limits, the clearer it becomes that campaign finance is a much better answer. Campaign finance reform has the potential of diminishing the power of the incumbency, a key objective of supporters of term limits, by placing limits on the amount of money an incumbent may spend, by making public funds and other resources such as free airtime to challengers, and by putting caps on the special interest contributions that are disproportionately directed to those who are already in power. It's time for some honest, upfront communication between citizens and government. And it's time for real accountability and results. By fixing what's wrong with the system and by keeping what works, including those politicians who are doing a good job and deserve to be reelected, the voters get the best of all possible worlds. And that's what campaigns and elections and governing are all about. Term limits are a limited notion that limit our choices as voters. We need more choices, not fewer. And we don't need to give up on the system. We need to take it back. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. I should point out that after the presentations, we will have brief rejoinders, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. The second half of this panel deals more from an academic perspective on the politics of term limits. In fact, both of our speakers participated in the subcommittee's hearings I alluded to earlier. They were two of the four participants in the first ever congressional hearings on term limits. Our first speaker of this section of the panel will be Mark Petracca, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of California at Irvine, the Anteaters. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago, and in recent years his academic writing has focused very much on term limits and the principle of rotation in office. Following Mark will be Tom Mann, who since 1987 has been the Director of Governmental Studies, the Governmental Studies program at the Brookings Institution. In 1991, he was named the first W. Averill Harriman Senior Fellow in American Governance at Brookings. Prior to his current appointment, Mann was Executive Director of the American Political Science Association. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. Mark, do you want to start?
Thank you, and thank you to the Cato Institute for allowing me to speak at about 6:15 in the morning California time. If term limitation was a bad idea, neither election victories nor a high level of public support would make it any better. But notwithstanding some of the things that were said by colleague Norman Ornstein at the House Subcommittee meeting regarding how silly the public tends to be about a lot of things, this time the public may in fact be right. Notwithstanding some of the other hyperbolized warnings that one continues to hear from the term limit critics. Term limits should be endorsed as a way of reestablishing one of the most fundamental principles of Republican political design, the principle of rotation in office, a principle that, as Mr. Will has suggested this morning, has significant consequence for the behavior of legislators, for the behavior of legislatures, and for the behavior and expectations of the American public. In addition, I believe that it is an appropriate term limitation, that is an appropriate antidote to the professionalization of political representation in American legislatures. But I'm not really going to talk about either of those two things. this morning. Frankly, the debate about term limitations in this country has become rather boring and rather tedious. There's an interesting debate going on right now with regard to the constitutional issues, which we'll hear more about this morning. But the litany that President Kaine just gave you of all the horrible things that are going to happen if you have term limits is the same litany that Willie Brown gave to the people of California 4 years ago. And it's the same litany that you can find in about 24 articles, some academic, some journalistic, that have been written. And frankly, the people on the proponent side haven't really advanced the cause either. The same arguments on both sides of this issue continue to be hurled at one another without consequence. The good news for the proponents is the voters don't buy the long litany of opposition arguments. The problem for the proponents, however, is that they're not making any intellectual or social science headway in persuading people that this is more than simply a reaction to Congress or to state legislatures that are not doing their jobs. And so to try to get us somewhere and really to continue the debate that Tom Mann and I were having 2 weeks ago on this issue, I'd like to take the time that I do have to try to answer very briefly for you 3 questions, one of which I hope will advance at least the social science debate about the impact of term limitations. And the 3 questions are: why was the principle of rotation in office left out of the Constitution? Second, why shouldn't we be too surprised that Alexander Hamilton opposed term limitation, opposed rotation in office? And third, why are the neo-Hamiltonian arguments made by modern term limit critics regarding experience largely without merit? Let me turn very quickly to the first set of arguments regarding why term limits do not appear in the Constitution, notwithstanding a 2,000-year history of the affiliation of the principle of rotation in office with the essential characteristic of Republican political design, going back to Aristotle, who said that democratic citizenship was possible only where there was a reciprocity of ruling and being ruled by turn. But if rotation was such a great idea, if it had been practiced widely in colonial charters and in state revolutionary constitutions and in the Articles of Confederation, why did the founders leave it out of the Constitution? I would argue that in deciding not to include the requirement of rotation in the Constitution, the convention delegates were not rejecting the principle or importance of rotation. Rather, they left it out for primarily prudential reasons. First, the requirement of rotation had been difficult at best to enforce during the fragile period of national union under the Articles of Confederation, and they didn't want to do anything which they felt would weaken the prospects for holding the new union together. Second, as John Fund has suggested, it was left out largely because mandatory rotation requirements were thought to be as entering into too much detail for a short document. Not sure I'm persuaded by that, but it's a second possible argument. Third, delegates to the convention thought rotation unnecessary, as Mr. Will has already suggested, much in the same way that Alexander Hamilton defended the absence of the Bill of Rights, arguing that the Constitution itself was a Bill of Rights. The founders concluded that because of short terms, federalism, the separation of powers, and the prevalence of the doctrine of instruction, term limits mandatory rotation requirement was unnecessary. Fourth, with specific reference to the Senate, the framers, in fact, may have expected Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution to provide for a full rotation of that body every 6 years. There is good evidence from the convention debates to validate this. It is also the way in which this provision was explained to state ratification conventions. And in my paper, I go through the various citations here to make this argument. It is also, interestingly enough, the way in which this section of the Constitution was explained by 19th century legal scholars and historians. Joseph Story, for example, suggests that this clause of the Constitution provides for a change of 1/3 of the members every 2 years, a change in members every 2 years. Thus, Story went on to say, the whole body is gradually changed in the course of 6 years. So it's possible that for the Senate, the founders thought that they had already adopted Harrington's rotative principle, which appears in 1656 in the book Oceana. The final, and probably the most important reason, though, that rotation doesn't appear in the Constitution is that the founders understood that the prevalent practice of voluntary rotation made it unnecessary. And you know what? They were right. Throughout the remainder of the 18th and throughout almost all of the 19th century, there was rotation in Congress and in the United States Senate. These points are treated at considerable length in the paper itself. Now, why should we not be so surprised that Mr. Hamilton was an opponent of term limits? First of all, Hamilton changed his mind, so we're not really sure what he truly believed, because in 1782, Hamilton, Madison, and Fitzsimmons said that term limitation was the true source of security in a representative republic. Well, which Mr. Hamilton should we believe? The Mr. Hamilton who said it's vital, or the Mr. Hamilton that said rotation was disruptive? Second, Hamilton was no friend of Republican government. And unlike a lot of modern term limit critics, at least he had the chutzpah to say so, and said it during the convention himself. He said, "I acknowledge I do not think favorably of Republican government, but address my remarks to those who do." Third, Hamilton's views on a number of key features of institutional design were completely out of step with prevalent political practices. It's no great surprise Hamilton opposed rotation. Remember, in his plan for national government, he wanted the president and the Senate to serve for life. And he wanted the federal government to appoint all governors. Almost nothing Hamilton endorsed in his national plan became part of the Constitution. Isn't it a surprise that he opposed rotation? There are also, and I don't have the time to go into this, there are also good responses by the Anti-Federalists to the substantive arguments Hamilton made. Now let me turn to the last point regarding experience. So much has been made about experience and the loss of it, and its incredible importance, and how important Mr. Hyde is to his constituency. There's nobody in the state of Illinois as important as Mr. Hyde to his constituency, and he alleged 2 weeks ago that there was no one capable of representing his constituents as well as he could. That's, of course, exactly the kind of hubris that Aristotle and Cicero and Harrington and Jefferson and Washington and Jackson and Lincoln understood would happen when you allowed these people to serve a little too long in office. Oh, 2 minutes. Good. I can make it. I'll even take a little break. The experience argument is the crux of the neo-Hamiltonian critique. If you beat empirically the experience argument, the concern about interest groups, staff, bureaucracy, executive branch influence goes away. Here's the response to the experience argument. First of all, there's little evidence that experience per se in the social science literature on the Congress, as opposed to simply experience measured by term in office, is positively correlated to legislative productivity and activity. There's an extremely good book by John Hibbing, which talks about the importance of tenure as a prerequisite to congressional activity. The problem is, Hibbing has interpreted and operationalized experience only by number of years served. There's nothing in this book to persuade you that if you change the seniority system in Congress, which is an inevitable consequence of term limits, that people wouldn't be every bit as capable of being legislatively active for their lack of time in office. Second, there is good evidence, which for some reason has been underutilized by term limit advocates, to show how important political amateurs are. And I reference here the book by David Cannon, published by the University of Chicago Press in 1990, entitled Actors, Athletes, and Astronauts. It's the first definitive study of political amateurs in Congress. And what Cannon finds is that amateurs have a hand in providing for democratic accountability in congressional elections, resisting socialization pressures in the House and Senate, party building, policy change, and institutional change. There's good evidence to suggest amateurs can be effective policymakers. Third, legislative experience certainly is important, but why assume new members of Congress will be utterly lacking in it? Recent social science research, in fact, shows the opposite. An increasing number of members of Congress have had state legislative experience, which means they're not the naive buffoons the critics and the neo-Hamiltonians would have you believe. Fourth, there are other kinds of experience which the professionalization of the legislature does not welcome. For example, studies of state professionalization show that professionalization is inversely related to the number of women in legislatures and the diversity of occupations. Fourth, or the fifth point, experience is not always as good as the advertisement. There's good evidence to show that there are negative consequences to people that are overexperienced, like James Payne's study, The Culture of Public Spending. What do these people experience that? Spending your tax dollars. Sixth, contrary to the lame duck argument that was raised earlier by my colleague from the University of California System, Dan Lowenstein, there's very good public choice literature to show that what in this literature is called shirking behavior does not occur. People do not vote differently when they're lame ducks. People do not behave differently when they're lame ducks. Final comment and my way out. Seventh comment about experience, which takes us back to Aristotle and the Hamiltonian critique of Hamilton by the Anti-Federalist. A truly rotative system does not squander experience, it enhances it. It enhances the experience of individual office holders. The advantage of ruling and being ruled in turn, per Aristotle, comes about when the ruler gains an appreciation of the sympathy and interest pertinent to the ruled, and when those who are ruled have a better understanding of the difficulties and challenging faced by rulers holding public office. We may not know with certainty or clarity the policy and political consequences of term limits, but we do know that it is a principle worth re-establishing in American constitutional government. Thank you.
Well, I'm left utterly breathless after Mark's passion and erudition here. I don't know how to begin, but I think I think I'll begin by congratulating Mr. Crane for holding this meeting and for inviting George Will to kick it off, because I thought Mr. Will provided a tenor and a sort of level of commentary and exchange that is sorely needed in public debates on term limits. I think he was also important in the sense that he made a lot of you feel really uncomfortable, because as you listen to him and as you seriously read his book, you discover that his view of American democracy and its problems and its needs is fundamentally different from many of yours. It's not politicians in Washington being out of touch with the public. It's too much in touch, hypersensitivity to public opinion, inability to take up Madison's charge to refine and enlarge public views. Now, that public that you love to reference as supporting term limits is with you, not George Will. They think the politicians here are out of touch, and that's the problem. But Will, of course, is arguing just the opposite. And I think that's worth noting and worth pointing out. Second thing I wanted to mention is that I really enjoy speaking forthrightly, openly, honestly, seriously with people who support term limits. I have on my floor at Brookings Bill Frenzel, who supported term limits not based on his experience in the House, but from the day he set foot in the House when he introduced his first constitutional amendment to limit terms. We find ourselves on opposite sides of this issue, and the case in Washington State and elsewhere, and I have enormous respect for his arguments and his concerns. I also really welcome the debate that's finally been engaged. Thus far, politicians fearful of being attacked as defenders of the present system and opponents of term limits have largely abdicated their responsibility to engage this debate. I've been hectoring and clamoring for congressional hearings and for sessions like this, so I'm really, really pleased to see it. Mark is bored with the debate. I think it's barely begun, and I think it's so important that it take place, because all you have to do is listen to George Will and realize that 99% of his argument has not been heard by the very American public who endorses term limits. So I think we've got a lot to talk about, and I apologize for the repetition in some of the arguments that end up coming forward. I've been fascinated to see how careerism has become the new evil, the new scapegoat in American politics. By God, it is responsible for virtually every ill that besets American society and politics. George was making an argument a couple of weeks ago that the reason NAFTA was in trouble was because of careerists and the lack of term limits. I had a hard time following the logic there. And then there was an argument about Congress never kills a program, and that's because of term limits. And then some programs got killed, and that became inconvenient. The bad weather in Washington certainly is connected to term limit. And there he's right. Air conditioning has had a profound influence on life here. Listen, I agree with George Will's objectives. Perhaps unlike many of you, I think Congress has become weakened as a deliberative body. I think changes over the last couple of decades, both in terms of the mobilization of interest outside of Congress and changes within the institution, the nature of the electoral process, have all worked to make the body so open, so vulnerable, so permeable that we get little of the face-to-face give and take that's so necessary in a representative form of government. In fact, as you know, representative government has fallen on hard times. It's deemed illegitimate, that somehow the only legitimate government is that in which the people speak directly, either through initiatives and referendums or some other basis for having their strongest sentiments expressed and registered. Well, you see, I think that's not our problem. I think our problem is that we have a political system that is so responsive to immediate public preferences, short-term public concerns, and so inattentive to long-term public needs that we've got to figure out a way to grapple with this. So I applaud George Will for trying to figure out a way of getting from here to there. What I criticize him for is the complete lack of analysis demonstrating how term limits would get us from here to there. I keep thinking in practical terms, okay, we got term limits. Now, who runs for office, under what conditions, and what incentives do they have when they're in the body before they can't come up to their term limits, and where do they go afterward? And how will the body operate under these new conditions? I mean, that's the argument you have to make. You can't go back and say we've had this idea, which we have for centuries, of rotation in office. Sure, I believe that. I accept it. You know, you can't just have this nostalgic longing for, quote, citizen legislators. You know, look around the world, see what's happening in governments, democratic governments everywhere. Show me a model. Give me an example of a legislative body operating under these conditions that would produce the outcomes that is desired by George Will or by any of you with different alternatives. I'm a sort of old conservative fuddy-duddy when it comes to the Constitution. I think the burden of proof is on those who would change the constitutional order. I think you have got to outline problems and then demonstrate that the remedy will deal effectively with those problems without bringing on other ills. I mean, that is the burden of proof that falls on term limit proponents. It doesn't fall on me to make the case, it falls on you, and therefore my posture is always to say, well, let's take a look. Let me see your arguments. Let me see your evidence, and then I'll reserve judgment until I've had a chance to do that. And I've done that, and I prepared some assessment for the congressional hearings. I've done it in a slightly revised paper for this conference. What I've done is gone to look at each of the arguments about careerism and its problems, of the need for more competition and turnover, greater accountability, and congressional organization and power. And what I have to tell you is that it's embarrassing. It is embarrassing, the lack of solid arguments and evidence that the supposed problems will be dealt with by the cure. Let me just take, since Mr. Jacobs spent so much time on the problem of incumbent advantages and the absence of competition, which I fully agree with. The problem is term limits aren't going to solve that at all. Term limits will not increase competition. It will decrease competition. Limits become floors. It doesn't accomplish what you have in mind. If you want to change the pattern of electoral competition, you have to do something to get resources in the hands of the challengers, and nothing here will do that at all. I could run through the nature of a term-limited legislature. I wish we had evidence to study the states, and after some years we'll have it. We have good research that's being launched, and maybe we'll be able to say something definitive about that. But at this stage, as I think through the implications of a term-limited legislature, I see an intensification of the individualism that's rampant in the Congress, and I see a weakness in central power in the ability to get anything done, and it worries me tremendously. The final point I would make, Mark ended with some comments about experience, and his arguments were serious ones and ought to be treated as such. There is no certain it is foolish to argue that new members can't be effective legislatively, because some can. But I think his overall posture reflects a certain contempt for the political process and for the whole notion of legislating. Legislative talent is not in abundant supply. You know, it encompasses a respect for the public, a capacity to listen to people who disagree with you, bargaining skills, a willingness to compromise, an appreciation for parliamentary procedure. You could say, anybody can do that. Well, I have respect for people who contribute to public service and to public life. I think it's a tough job. And I think we have too much contempt and disdain for those. I think we ought to be encouraging people to enter public service and alter the incentives and rewards and structures to make sure the institution becomes more deliberative. Thank you.
So that we have time for questions, I'm going to ask the panelists to limit their rejoinders to just 90 seconds or 2 minutes, and then we'll open it up. Paul, do you want to start?
I'll start, and I'll go as quickly as I can. First of all, the question about whether Congress will be weakened vis-a-vis the president. There's no evidence been presented that the president will gain power under term limits, and there's been an awful lot of evidence that while the president has been term limited, the power has increased, and Congress without term limits is falling very rapidly in public opinion. Secondly, about increased reliance on staff, there's an argument that the staff, the bureaucracy, the lobbyists will gain power under term limits. These are all groups that are gaining enormous power today, and as tenure in Congress has increased, so has the power of the staff, the bureaucracy, and the lobbyists. Who is opposing term limits? Public employee unions, lobbyists across the board. The staff, polls show 85% of congressional staffers oppose term limits. If it's so good for them, why do they all oppose it? Third, the idea that under term limits that people will think short-term instead of long-term. Here's a definition for short-term over long-term. $4 trillion national debt. That is short-term over long-term. It's happening right now. Term limits, I think, will reverse it. Third, or fourth, the idea about them thinking about their next job. Now, it is almost an absolute truism that when a member of Congress leaves Congress today, they never go back to their district. They stay here in Washington and continue to lobby or do some other work around the federal government. So the idea of people thinking about their next job or being in the pocket of special interests or lobbyists, they are today. Term limits will mean people come for a short period of time and will have a career to go back to. Fifth, the idea about that George Will talked about, that they're too in touch. Are members of Congress in touch or out of touch? Here is, I think, the interesting dilemma. Because members of Congress leave their homes and come to live in Washington for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, they are not in touch because they don't live the life. They visit on weekends. But they aren't a part of those communities. They don't live the same life. They don't have the same medical coverage. They don't have the same work experience. They don't live in their community, so they're out of touch. But on the flip side, does that make them somehow more deliberative and more courageous? No, because they're fixated on winning re-election, so they never have to go home, so they can always stay in Washington, D.C., and so they're both out of touch, and yet they don't get any of the deliberative process or any of the courage that might come from saying, I don't have to worry about re-election. And what it means is that when they have a moral view that says this legislation is wrong, they are giving up voting against that legislation because they would rather stay in office than be right. We
Paul.
think term limits will encourage more courage in office.
I got to cut you off there. Becky?
Yes, there's been some discussion about having imperial data to talk about what term limits would really do in varied legislative bodies. Well, there is a, in local elections and local areas, there have been term limits for some years. For example, San Mateo County in California has had term limits since 1980. And in some research done on that particular area, done by a PhD candidate out of the Political Science Department at the University of Oklahoma, that research, the preliminary findings showed that the passage of term limits in San Mateo County has so far contradicted the conventional expectations of the effects of term limits in the following ways. The limitation of terms has not increased voter turnout. Competition for office, measured by the number of candidates entering a race for office, has decreased. Members of the Board of County Supervisors nearing the end of their allowed terms are, for the most part, seeking to run for other offices. Members of the Board of County Supervisors voted themselves a pay increase in 1988 and have further voted to set future pay increases automatically at 80% of salary of the municipal court judge. So where we do have some limits and some information based on what term limits would do, it doesn't sound like they do what they're expected to do.
Thank you. Mark?
Well, Orange County just happens to have the oldest city in the country, Santa Ana, that's had term limits since 1966. And I agree with something Tom Mann said to me at the hearings, that municipalities aren't really that applicable to the federal government. But of the 9 cities out of 31 in Orange County that have been studied for the effects of the term limits there, they actually unfortunately contradict Dave Roush's study of San Mateo County. So we have mixed evidence. The comparative example argument that Tom Mann made is important. Were that we had one. Unfortunately, the only place where anybody seems to have studied the impact of term limits on a nation state is Costa Rica. And I'm not sure we want to compare the United States for a whole lot of reasons to the country of Costa Rica. I'm also not convinced, frankly, that if we had an example, the term limit critics would be awed by it. Because the easiest response to any example that you could bring to bear by way of comparison with the United States is, well, it's not the United States. I mean, there is no place in this world that you could really argue is a comparable case study. So the best we're going to be able to hope for is precisely what Tom Mann has suggested. That is good studies on the places. You know, California, if it were a nation state, would be the 9th largest nation state in the world. So it's a decent place to make comparisons. And what do we see happening in California so far? In terms of the who run questions, different people run. More women got elected. More minorities got elected. People who are from business got elected. People who are not affiliated with members of members of legislative staff got elected. How has the Assembly been behaving for the last year and a half since we've had the class of '92, the so-called Prop 140 babies? Pretty well. Didn't have a budget crisis this year. Passed some important bipartisan legislation that these 27 people believe was at least partly produced by their desire to have a quick impact because they know they're in there for only 6 years and then they're on to something else. Are these people going to run for other offices? You bet they are. And that's a good thing. That's another way in which experience under term limits is not squandered. People rotate much like they did in the 19th century, and the political system is better off for it.
Thanks, Mark. Tom?
Well, I got to go last, so perhaps we should go immediately to the questions.
Okay, and if any of the panelists have questions for each other, feel free to participate. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I work with Congressman Pete Hoekstra, who is a first-year...
Would you also hold the microphone right in front of your mouth?
I work with Congressman Pete Hoekstra, who is a first-year member of Congress who, for 15 years, worked at Herman Miller, which is a Fortune 500 company considered one of the most admired and best places to work at in the country. Now, recently, he took issue with a mandated workplace cooperation bill being promoted by Ted Kennedy and Bill Ford. Ted Kennedy is chairman of Labor in the Senate, and Bill Ford is chairman of Ed and Labor in the House. Now, you've got a first-year member of Congress who spent 15 years in the business community talking about mandated cooperation and saying that, you know, why are we doing this? Going up against 2 guys who've been in the House of Representatives for 30 years. who have never managed a work team, except maybe their own staff, who've never had to produce a profit. So I guess I'm really bringing up this neo-Hamiltonian anti-term limit argument that experienced legislators have all the answers, and they don't. People with real-world experience, I think demonstrate that they know a lot more about what's going on in the real world than people who spend their whole careers in Washington.
Tom or Becky?
I'm sorry, I mean, you're conflating a substantive policy view with an institutional argument that just doesn't work at all. The fact is the present system of non-term limited members allowed your member of Congress to get elected and to bring his experience to bear in the legislative process. I say bravo. Just because he had that experience does that not mean that his vote should be weighted more heavily than those who didn't have that experience.
It may not be an argument for term limits. I think it works in favor of term limits, but it is an argument that says experience outside of Congress ought to be considered as valuable as experience in Congress, because it seems to me that the experience from being in Congress is often how to cut deals, how to run for re-election, and experience outside of Congress is going to be much more attuned to what it takes to make a living, to run a business, and to work in the private sector, which is, after all, what government regulates and controls and deals with.
In the back? Right there, yeah. Microphone.
Hi, I'm Chris Kobach from Yale Law School.
Hold it real close to your face. Thank you.
As you're no doubt aware, the November '92 election results, which saw this flood of term limits in 14 states, yielded an apparently incongruous result, and that is that in each of those 14 states, while term limits were overwhelmingly endorsed, the incumbents were also reelected, which suggests to me that maybe people really aren't all that worried about the advantages which incumbents hold, or at least not in their own districts. They're not all worried about it. So that something else must be driving the voters. And I'm just curious what the members of the panel, which conclusions they incongruity in the results.
Mark?
Actually, it's not an incongruity at all. There's a great article that I haven't seen cited yet in the term limitation literature, probably because it's written by a bunch of economists, A. Dick and J. Lott, entitled Reconciling Voters' Behavior and Legislative Term Limits in the Journal of Public Economics, not a place that you'd probably go to find information on term limits, January 1993, page 1 through 14. And they argue that it's entirely consistent because what voters are trying to do is overcome the free rider difficulty of imposing, getting rid of their own congressmen, putting their districts at a disadvantage. Therefore, it's consistent for them to continue to put their own person back in office while simultaneously stopping everybody else from going back in, because then that allows them to achieve what they really want to achieve, which is change. But by simply getting rid of their own person first, they impose on themselves real serious free rider economic problems in the economic sense, in the way in which public choice theorists talk about that they are apparently unwilling to do. It's a wonderful piece which reconciles what appears to be some kind of schizophrenic behavior.
I had a gentleman in Ohio tell me that he was supporting term limits because, and he did vote to send his members of Congress back, but he was supporting term limits because he really didn't like the people from Massachusetts, and it was his intent then to be able to get rid of those fellows they keep sending back.
Good reason.
Term limits provide voters with an opportunity for doing two things. One, to strike out against the institution of Congress, for which they have great contempt. And the other is to limit, as Becky said, the terms of all those other members that represent other districts. But the main reason they're voting for their own incumbent in most cases is because of the nature of the choice presented to them, the fact that their incumbent has greater advantages, more visibility, and the way to deal with that problem is to buck up the resources available to challengers and to structure a system that encourages able people to enter public life, not to structure a system that demonstrates contempt for public life and thereby discouraging people from so participating.
Let me jump in here to say that I disagree that term limits and term limit activists somehow have a bad opinion of those people in public life. We would like to see the institution saved because we think the institution is going down. But I think the key element here is that allowing these advantages that people have, that incumbents have, and we've listed them all, and there's a litany, and you agree that those advantages are there. The solution by those people who oppose term limits is to say Congress will somehow take care of it. It's Congress who could pass campaign finance reform but refuses to do so, who could change the frank but refuses to do so. And what the dilemma here and the battle is that the people have come up with a reform that's come from the grassroots that's to limit terms. And people in Washington and the Congress have said, no, let us micromanage the system and create this new complex system. The answer is simple, and sometimes it's derided because of its simplicity, but the answer is simple. Rotation in office will decrease these advantages because no one can make a career out of public service.
But you acknowledge that it won't have any impact as long as incumbents are able to run for re-election under this term set by the Constitution. So you're doing nothing to increase competition in any election save the open seat when the incumbent comes up against that ceiling.
Actually, that's not true. In fact, a recent study by John Armour pointed out in studying gubernatorial elections that not only is there more competition, obviously, in the open seat election, but there is actually much more competition in term-limited states when there's not an open seat than there is in the non-term limited states. And the reason is people are wanting to run because they realize they can gain name recognition, they can get into the process, and in the future there will be an open seat. But where there's not an open seat, like in Congress today, nobody runs because they don't have any expectation down the road that there will be an open seat.
This is where the length of the limit becomes very important.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Yes,
what are we talking about? What are term limits?
As long as, well, they vary from 6 to 12 years.
For the House.
For the House. And I think the answer to Tom's good question about whether or not competition is going to be increased here is if you look at what's happening over the last 2 election cycles in California, where at least in what is typically a very non-competitive one-party county, namely Orange County, where basically a group of people get together in a back room and decide who's going to run for office because there's a 3-to-1 Republican to Democratic ratio, there's been much more competition there for elected office. Why? Because the terms are 6 years. Which means it does make sense from a strategic name identification advantage for people, even before the open seat is actually going to come up, to start throwing their hat into the ring. Now, it's not true that the general elections are more competitive in Orange County, but the primaries are. And the reason that I wouldn't expect the general elections, even under term limits, to be more competitive is because of the domination of the Republican Party in the county and a 3-to-1 Republican
So, Mark, you want a
voter
Congress with limits of 6 years for House members?
If you're going to ask me personally, as you heard me say 2 weeks ago, I would advocate a term limit of 8 years to coordinate with the terms of the presidency.
Paul Jacobs from U.S.
I would just point
Competitive races by changing campaign finance reform, by changing the way elections.
precisely for this reason, among some others, but this is a very key reason. And it's interesting to note that the majority of initiatives in the states have been for 6 years in the House, and all the polling data that we have seen both in the states and nationally shows that the American people support 6-year limits overwhelmingly. The plurality winner is actually 2 terms. The concept of running, if you do a good job running one more time and stepping down, just like for the president, is actually the general concept. But because House terms are 2 years, most people favor 6 years.
God save the Republic.
God save the Republic. In the back, we have time for one more question, then we're going to break and go to our second panel.
I'm John Armour. I'm the former professor who wrote the study, and my question is to Mrs. McCain on the governors. And I looked at 50 years of governors' elections, 802 elections. And my question is, would you, as president of the League of Women Voters, take a look at that study and its base data, and if it satisfies you that there is greater competition in term-limited states than in non-limited states, and that the voters get more of what they want in those governors' races in limited states, would the League of Women Voters change its position?
Well, the League of Women Voters arrives at its position a little differently than most groups, and I speak on behalf of the members, and we go through a consensus process by which our members do a pro-con study of the issue. They take a look at the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then the members decide. So we would have to go through that process in order to change our position. Our position is actually based on the congressional and presidential separation of powers. We feel very strongly that the Congress is to be there to represent the people, that it needs to be tough, it needs to be strong, and it needs to have every tool it can to represent its constituents. And we support actually term limits for the president, because we don't think that one individual should have all that much power. So our position is not an anti-term limit all the way down. So comparing governors with congressional term limits actually is just one, and the competitiveness is just one actual component of our position. We support competitive races by changing campaign finance reform, by changing the way elections are conducted, a whole series of things to get more competition and to get voters back on the track. We agree with much of the frustration of government and are in total agreement with the term limits supporters that something is definitely broke and it needs to be fixed. We just disagree on how we would do that.
Becky, let me ask you a question. Polls show that 75 to 80% of Americans support term limits, and interestingly enough, a higher percentage of women than men support it. Does that reflect the fact that your membership is not representative of women in general?
We don't, well, we don't claim to speak on behalf of all citizens based on a poll that was done by uninformed folks. We claim, we represent the members who belong to our organization, which are both men and women, I might add. We do have male members, and we'd welcome your participation. So we don't claim to have taken a poll and called people at 5 o'clock in the evening while they were preparing dinner to get a response. We've actually tried to do an intellectual discussion of the issue and take a look at the options and made a decision, and all I claim to represent, sir, are my members and not the general public.
Tom, do you want a final word?
Just a final comment. The Larry Hansen and the Joyce Foundation has been conducting a series of focus group, in-depth discussions around the country, moving from campaign finance now to term limits. He just reported in to me, and what he discovered is that when you sit people down, enter discussions, talk about cost and benefits, when you talk about alternatives, it turns out this support, overwhelming support for term limits declines, just as George Will would predict. George Will would be very unhappy with the arguments used by supporters that so many members of the public support him. That would give him pause, but he'll be reassured to see that when people are given the opportunity to stop and think and deliberate, that some of that overwhelming support for term limits begins to recede.
That's going to be the last word. I want to thank Thomas Mann from the Brookings Institution, Becky Kane from the League of Women Voters, Paul Jacob from U.S. Term Limits, and Mark Petracca from UC Irvine. Thank you all.
The Cato Institute is a public policy research foundation which supports limited government, individual liberty, and peace. The organization is named for Cato's letters, pamphlets read in the American colonies in the early 18th century, which were said to have played a role in laying the philosophical foundation of the American Revolution. While on the subject of Congress, we'd like to remind you that we'll talk with congressional leaders tomorrow morning on our companion network, C-SPAN. Our 8 a.m.